My wife and I were driving home from a business conference in Nevada when this happened. We had spent most of the day at a business conclave and were exhausted by the time we finally left. It was close to midnight. We were somewhere along Route 50, miles away from any major town. If you've ever driven through parts of Nevada at night, you know how empty it can feel. There were stretches of road where we could drive for 20 or 30 minutes without seeing another vehicle. My wife had been asleep for most of the drive. I was struggling to keep my eyes open. We had originally planned to drive until we reached a proper hotel, but after another hour of almost complete darkness, I decided that wasn't happening. Then we saw the motel. It appeared almost out of nowhere. A faded sign stood beside the road. Only a few letters were still illuminated. I couldn't even make out the name. There were maybe 6 or 7 rooms in the entire building. My wife woke up when I pulled into the parking lot. She looked at the motel and immediately said, "Are you serious?" I told her we only needed a few hours of sleep. She reluctantly agreed. There were no other cars in the parking lot. Not one. I remember thinking that was strange. But at that point, I was too tired to care. We walked into the office. An old man was sitting behind the counter. He looked like he was probably in his 70s. Gray hair, wrinkled face, heavy coat, and an expression that made it seem like we had personally offended him by walking through his door. I told him we needed a room for the night. He stared at us for several seconds. Then he asked, "Just the two of you?" I thought it was an odd question. I said yes. He looked at my wife, then back at me. Then he gave us a price that was surprisingly cheap. I asked if the room had a bathroom. He said yes. I handed him the money. He slid a key across the counter. Room 6. As I picked it up, I noticed him smiling. Not a friendly smile. More like he knew something we didn't. My wife noticed it too. As we walked toward the room, I looked back. The old man was still watching us, and he was still smiling. I unlocked the door. The room was old but reasonably clean. There was a bed, a small television, a dresser, and a window facing the back of the property. My wife immediately started complaining about the smell. It smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke. I told her we'd survive a few hours. We locked the door. I checked it twice. Then we went to sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when my wife woke me. She was whispering my name. I opened my eyes. "What?" she said. "Do you hear that?" I listened. At first I heard nothing. Then I heard it. Breathing. Heavy breathing. Right outside the window. I sat up. My wife was staring toward the curtains. The breathing continued. Slow, deep, almost rhythmic. I grabbed my phone. There was no signal. I walked toward the window. My wife grabbed my arm. "Don't." I pulled the curtain back slightly. The parking lot behind the motel was completely dark. I couldn't see anyone. Then I noticed something. There were shadows moving near the tree line. I opened the curtain a little farther. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them. At first I thought it was an animal. Then one of the eyes moved upward. Another appeared beside it. Then another. They were scattered among the trees. Some were low to the ground. Others were much higher. They were all staring toward our window. I stepped away. My wife whispered, "What are those?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. The breathing stopped. For several seconds, everything was silent. Then we heard something else. Footsteps inside the motel, coming down the hallway. Slowly, one step at a time. My wife grabbed my hand. The footsteps stopped outside our room. Neither of us moved. Then the doorknob turned. I had locked it. The handle shook. Once, twice, then stopped. I whispered to my wife that we needed to leave. I reached for the rifle I kept locked in my vehicle for hunting trips. I had brought it with me because we were planning to spend a few days outdoors after the conference. I grabbed it and stood beside the door. My wife moved behind me. For almost a minute, nothing happened. Then the lock clicked. The door slowly opened. I raised the rifle. The old motel owner stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing the clothes I'd seen earlier. He was dressed in some kind of dark robe. There were strange symbols stitched into the fabric. In his hand was a long, oddly shaped knife. It didn't look like anything you'd use for ordinary work. He looked at us and smiled. Then he whispered something I couldn't understand. I shouted at him to stop. He kept coming. I fired. The sound was deafening inside that tiny room. The old man collapsed just inside the doorway. For a moment, everything went completely silent. My ears were ringing. My wife was crying. I was staring at the man on the floor, trying to understand what had just happened. Then we heard screaming outside. Not human screaming. At least not anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded like several voices shrieking at the same time. We looked toward the window. The eyes were still there, but now the figures attached to them were moving. Dozens of people emerged from the darkness around the trees. They were wearing dark clothing. Some were crawling. Some were standing completely still. Others were moving toward the motel. And all of them were making the same horrible sound. My wife screamed that we needed to go. We ran. I grabbed our bags. She grabbed the car keys. We didn't even bother locking the motel room. We ran through the office. The front door was open. The old man's body was still lying in the hallway behind us. Outside, the people in the trees began moving faster. We reached our car. I started the engine. One of the figures ran toward us. It stopped just a few feet from the vehicle. For a second, our headlights illuminated its face. I saw a person, an ordinary-looking person, except their mouth was open far too wide, and they were smiling. I hit the accelerator. We tore out of the parking lot. My wife kept looking behind us. I didn't. I just drove. We drove for almost an hour before we finally saw signs of civilization. We eventually found a small police station in the nearest town. We ran inside and started talking over each other. At first, the officers didn't seem to know what to make of our story. Then I told them about the motel, the address, the old man, the room, everything. They contacted other officers and sent a patrol car back toward the property. We waited. An hour passed, then another. Eventually, 2 officers returned. They had found the motel. But something was wrong. There was no sign of the people we had seen. No one was hiding in the woods. No other vehicles were there. And according to the officers, the motel had been abandoned for years. I told them that was impossible. We had just stayed there. They checked the property again. That's when they found the body of the old man. The same man I had shot. Except the police told us something that made no sense. The man who owned that motel had supposedly died years earlier. They found old records connecting him to the property. But there was no explanation for how his body could have been there. The police also discovered a hidden room underneath the motel. Inside were photographs, clothing, symbols, and evidence suggesting that the building had been used by a secretive group for years. They believed it had been some kind of cult meeting place. There were records of people who had disappeared in the surrounding area, but most of the people associated with the group were never found. The police searched the surrounding desert and forest for days. They found nothing. No people, no camps, no bodies, nothing. My wife and I eventually returned home. We tried to put the entire thing behind us. But there was one thing I couldn't forget. Those eyes outside our window. The police never found anyone who could explain them. And they never found the people we saw running into the forest. A few months later, I searched online for information about the motel. I found an old newspaper article. The motel had been investigated decades earlier after several travelers disappeared along that stretch of highway. The article mentioned that the owner had always denied knowing anything about the disappearances. There was one photograph of him. It was old and grainy, but I recognized him immediately. It was the same man, the same face, the same eyes, the same crooked smile. The photograph had been taken almost 30 years before the night we met him. I still don't know what we encountered that night. Maybe the police were right and it was some kind of cult. Maybe there were people living out there who had been hiding for years. Or maybe there was something else in those woods. Something that the police never found. The motel was eventually demolished. At least that's what I was told. But every once in a while, when I'm driving through Nevada at night, I still find myself looking toward the trees and wondering if those eyes are still out there, watching the road, waiting for someone else to get tired enough. I own a small motel on the outskirts of the city. It's not the kind of place people visit for vacations. Most of my customers are truck drivers, construction workers, and people who are simply passing through and need somewhere cheap to sleep for a night. Because we're so far from the city, business can be unpredictable. Some nights every room is occupied. Other nights I might have 2 or 3 guests. This happened on one of the quietest nights I can remember. It was around 9 p.m. when a man walked into the office. He looked to be in his mid-30s. He was bald, thin, and had the tired appearance of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. There was something else about him that I noticed immediately. He looked completely out of it. His eyes were red, his movements were slow, and he had the unmistakable appearance of someone who had been smoking something. He asked if I had a room available. I did. I didn't ask questions. I'd had plenty of strange customers over the years. As long as someone paid and didn't cause trouble, I didn't care what they did in their personal life. I gave him the key to room 6. He paid in cash. Before leaving, he looked at me for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he smiled and walked upstairs. I remember thinking he was weird, but nothing more. The motel became quiet after that. By midnight, I had locked the office and gone to sleep in the small room behind the reception desk. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard a noise. Someone was moving around. I opened my eyes. There was a man standing beside my bed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was the guest from room 6. He was standing incredibly close to me, just staring. He didn't say anything. I asked him what he was doing in my room. He didn't answer. I turned on the lamp. He was looking directly at me. His face was expressionless. Then he finally spoke. I want to eat. I was confused. I told him there was a food delivery number posted inside every room. He could call the restaurant himself. He shook his head. No. Then he repeated himself. I want to eat. I told him again that I didn't have food available. He just stared at me for maybe 10 seconds. It was one of the longest 10 seconds of my life. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. It was slow and strangely empty. Then he turned around and walked out. I watched him disappear into the hallway. I locked my door afterward. I couldn't explain why, but something about that interaction made me uncomfortable. I tried going back to sleep. About 20 minutes later, I heard a scream. It came from upstairs. A man's scream. Then another. I immediately got out of bed. I ran into the hallway. The lights upstairs were on. I could hear someone screaming for help. I ran toward the sound. It was coming from room 8. The door was partially open. I pushed it open and froze. There was blood everywhere. It was on the floor, on the bed, on the walls. A truck driver who had checked in earlier that evening was lying on the floor, conscious but barely moving. His leg had been horribly injured, and sitting beside him was the man from room 6. He was holding a piece of flesh in his hands. He was eating it. Raw. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain kept telling me this couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. The man looked up. His face was covered in blood. He stared at me. The truck driver was crying and trying to move away from him. I finally screamed at the man to stop. He stopped eating. He slowly stood up. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he started walking toward me. I backed away. He moved faster. Then he suddenly charged. I reacted without thinking. I kicked him as hard as I could. He doubled over. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find. A folding chair. I swung it at his head. Once, then again. He collapsed onto the floor. I stood there holding the chair, shaking so badly I could barely breathe. The truck driver was still alive, but he was losing a terrifying amount of blood. I grabbed my phone and called emergency services. I told them there had been an attack at my motel. I told them someone was badly injured. And I told them I had knocked the attacker unconscious. The police arrived first, then paramedics. They rushed the truck driver to the hospital. The man from room 6 was arrested. I later learned that he had a history of drug abuse and several previous arrests. But what disturbed me most was what investigators discovered afterward. He had been connected to a small group of people involved in violent crimes. There was evidence suggesting that he had previously consumed human flesh. The police eventually determined that the attack hadn't been random. He had apparently become obsessed with the idea of eating human flesh and had been looking for a victim. The truck driver survived. Barely. He lost a significant amount of blood and spent several days in the hospital. I visited him once. I didn't know what to say. He looked at me and simply said, "Thank you for coming upstairs." I haven't forgotten that sentence, because if I had ignored that scream, I don't know what would have happened. The motel has been quieter since then. Sometimes I'll walk upstairs late at night and remember what that hallway looked like. The blood, the screaming, that man standing over the truck driver. But there's one thing that still bothers me. When I think back to 2 a.m. when that man was standing beside my bed, I keep thinking about what he said. "I want to eat." At the time, I thought he was asking me for food. Now I realize he wasn't. He was telling me exactly what he wanted. And I was the first person he had seen that night. I just happened to survive long enough for someone else to hear the scream.
I was in my early 20s when I started working at a small motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a fancy place. Just 2 floors, a small reception desk, and maybe 20 rooms. Most of our guests were people passing through for a night or two. I worked room service during the evening shift. Most nights were boring, until the woman in room 17 checked in. She was probably in her late 30s or early 40s. She was attractive, confident, and seemed unusually friendly with me from the moment she arrived. When I brought her bags upstairs, she kept making little comments about how young I looked and how she hadn't expected the motel to have such handsome staff. I laughed it off. I figured she was just being playful. Later that evening, she ordered dinner. I took the tray to her room. When she opened the door, she was wearing a different outfit and immediately started flirting with me again. I politely thanked her and tried to keep things professional. She smiled. "You're no fun." I laughed and left. I didn't think much about it afterward. Around midnight, the front desk phone rang. It was room 17. The woman wanted something to eat. I prepared her order and took it upstairs. When I knocked, she opened the door almost immediately. This time, she didn't even pretend she was interested in the food. She invited me inside. I told her I was supposed to get back downstairs. She smiled and said it would only take a minute. I don't know what exactly made me stay. Maybe it was the attention. Maybe it was the fact that I was young and stupid. Whatever the reason, I stepped inside. The room was dim. Only one lamp was on. The curtains were completely closed. There was a strange smell in the room. Something metallic underneath a heavy perfume. I couldn't identify it. She started talking to me. At first, it was harmless. Then she moved closer. Eventually, I stopped thinking about work. We started kissing. Nothing about the room seemed particularly strange in that moment. But even then, I couldn't shake a feeling. I kept feeling like someone was watching us. Every few seconds, I'd glance toward the bathroom. Nothing. Then toward the closet. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. The woman noticed me looking around. "What are you looking for?" I smiled and told her it was nothing. She pulled me closer. That's when I noticed the suitcase. It was sitting beside the bed. I hadn't noticed it before. It was large, old, and partly unzipped. Something was sticking out from the opening. At first, I thought it was a piece of clothing. Then I realized it had fingers. A hand. A human hand. I froze. For a second, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I stared at it. The skin was pale. The fingers were completely still. I slowly pulled away from the woman. She looked at me. What happened? I couldn't answer. I looked toward the suitcase again. The hand was still there. Then I heard something from behind me. A soft creak, like someone had shifted their weight. I turned toward the bathroom. The door was slightly open. I suddenly remembered that strange feeling I'd had since entering the room. Someone was watching us. I knew it. I just didn't know from where. The woman stood up. "What are you looking at?" I forced myself to smile. "I think I'm going to be sick." She looked confused. I pointed toward the bathroom. "Can I use it?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. I walked toward the bathroom. My legs were shaking. I entered and immediately locked the door. There was a tiny window. It wasn't meant to be an exit, but it was my only chance. I opened it. Cold air hit my face. Behind me, I heard the woman knock. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer. She knocked again. Harder. "What's wrong?" I climbed onto the sink. Then I heard the bathroom door handle move. I pushed the window open as far as it would go. The moment the woman realized what I was doing, she started shouting.
"Stop it!"
I squeezed through the window and dropped onto the ground outside. I landed badly, but I got up immediately. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the motel parking lot. I grabbed my phone and called the police. At first, they thought I was drunk or confused. I told them there was a body inside room 17. That got their attention. Several officers arrived within minutes. They went upstairs. I stayed outside. I remember watching the second floor window the entire time. About 20 minutes later, an officer came downstairs. He asked me to sit in the patrol car. Then he told me something I'll never forget. The woman wasn't alone. There was a man hiding inside the room. He had apparently been hiding in the bathroom the entire time. That's why I kept feeling like someone was watching me. The suitcase contained human remains, and police eventually discovered evidence linking the couple to several other murders. They weren't ordinary criminals. According to investigators, the couple had been traveling from town to town, choosing isolated motels and targeting strangers. What made the case even more disturbing was what investigators discovered about their victims. They weren't killing for money. They weren't trying to hide a business. They appeared to be doing it because they enjoyed it. And some of the evidence suggested they had been consuming parts of their victims afterward. I gave the police my statement that night. I told them everything I remembered. The next morning, I quit my job. I never went back to that motel. For months afterward, I couldn't stay in a hotel room without checking the bathroom first. I'd check the closet. I'd check under the bed. I'd even check behind the curtains. But there's one thing I still think about. That feeling I had when I first entered room 17. The feeling that someone was watching me. I used to think it was just anxiety. Now I know there really was someone there. Someone standing only a few feet away, watching me completely unaware of what was sitting inside that suitcase. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't noticed that hand. Because if I had stayed another 5 minutes, I don't think I'd be here telling this story.